The heat of August 1944 pressed down on northern Florida like a physical weight, the kind of humid thickness that made every breath feel substantial and turned simple movement into effort. At Camp Blanding, a sprawling military installation that had been converted to house prisoners of war, approximately 200 German soldiers captured in North Africa and Sicily lived behind wire fences under the supervision of American guards who seemed almost relaxed compared to the military police the prisoners had expected. These men were Afrika Korps veterans, soldiers who had fought under Rommel in the desert campaigns, who had experienced the particular hell of warfare in North Africa, where water was more precious than ammunition and the sun was an enemy as implacable as any human adversary. The announcement came during morning roll call, delivered by an American sergeant whose German was heavily accented but comprehensible. A work detail would be organized for special assignment. 50 prisoners would be selected, transported off base for approximately 8 hours, returning before evening count. The nature of the work was described vaguely: maintenance, general labor, assistance with a project that required additional manpower. The prisoners selected responded with the practiced efficiency of military men accustomed to following orders regardless of their content or purpose, gathering at the designated assembly point with the resigned acceptance that characterized captive soldiers everywhere. The propaganda they had absorbed during their years of service painted specific pictures of American character and American society. Americans were materialistic and soft, made weak by abundance and luxury, lacking the martial discipline that made German soldiers superior. American treatment of prisoners would reflect this softness, adequate but careless, governed by rules but without the rigor that proper military organization required. The reality of American POW camps had been surprising in ways the propaganda had not prepared them for. The food was better and more plentiful than what German soldiers had received even before capture. The guards maintained order but without the harsh brutality that Wehrmacht discipline demanded. The living conditions, while clearly those of captivity, lacked the deliberate harshness that prisoners had been conditioned to expect. But the men climbing into the backs of open-bed army trucks that August morning still carried assumptions about their captors, still processed their experience through frameworks built by years of Nazi indoctrination. Whatever this work detail involved, it would be labor, physical, demanding, probably uncomfortable in the brutal Florida heat. That was what prisoners did. They worked. They contributed their labor to their captors' purposes. They endured until the war ended and repatriation became possible. The convoy consisted of 4 trucks escorted by 2 jeeps carrying armed guards, a standard security arrangement for prisoner transport. The drive took perhaps 40 minutes, heading east from Camp Blanding through landscape that seemed almost alien to men whose service had taken them from European cities to North African desert. Dense pine forests, palmetto scrub, swamps where cypress trees grew in standing water. The peculiar wild beauty of Florida's interior that even war had not substantially altered. The prisoners, sitting on benches in the truck beds, watched this scenery pass with the interest of men who had been confined for months and found even unfamiliar landscape preferable to the monotony of camp routine. The trucks emerged from forest onto coastal highway, and suddenly the landscape changed. To the east, visible between gaps in the vegetation, stretched the Atlantic Ocean, vast, blue, extending to a horizon where water met sky in a line so perfect it seemed drawn with a ruler. The prisoners, many of whom had not seen the ocean since their transport ships had crossed the Mediterranean, sat forward, attention focused on that expanse of water that represented both barrier and connection. The physical separation from a Europe that was home and the same ocean that touched European shores thousands of miles distant. The convoy turned onto a smaller road, descended through sand dunes held in place by sea oats and scrub vegetation, and emerged onto a beach that stretched in both directions as far as vision extended. White sand, gentle surf, the kind of coastline that would have been packed with vacationers in peacetime but now was nearly deserted, reserved for military use and whatever purposes the authorities deemed appropriate. The truck stopped. The prisoners were ordered out, formed into loose ranks on the sand that was already hot despite the morning hour. American guards took positions around the perimeter, not threatening but watchful, maintaining the security protocols that governed prisoner handling. And then an American officer approached, a lieutenant by his insignia, young, probably only a few years older than many of the prisoners. carrying himself with the casual confidence that characterized American military bearing. He addressed them in English, with one of the guards translating into German for those whose English was minimal. The translation conveyed something that seemed, initially, like a mistake or a misunderstanding. They had not been brought here to work. There was no labor assignment, no project requiring their physical effort, no task to be completed. They had been brought to the beach for a different purpose entirely: to swim, to spend several hours in the ocean, to experience something other than the routine of captivity and the monotony of camp life. This was not reward for good behavior, not privilege earned through cooperation. It was simply an acknowledgement that they were human beings, that even prisoners needed occasional respite, that the war had made them enemies but had not made them less than men deserving of occasional mercy. The silence that followed this announcement was profound. The prisoners looked at each other, at the guards, at the officer who had just told them something that violated every expectation they had carried about how captured soldiers were treated. Swimming was recreation, was pleasure, was the kind of activity that belonged to peacetime and freedom, not to captivity and military control. That their captors would transport them to a beach, provide them with hours of leisure, trust them not to attempt escape despite being given access to open water. These things did not align with any framework they possessed for understanding the American military or American society. One prisoner, a sergeant named Klaus Hartmann, who had fought at El Alamein and survived the retreat across Libya, would later write in a letter discovered decades afterward, "We stood on that beach expecting orders, expecting to be told what work we must do, and instead, we were told to swim. To swim. As though we were not prisoners but simply soldiers on leave, as though the ocean was not barrier but gift. As though our captors saw us not as defeated enemies to be exploited, but as men who might benefit from a few hours of something other than confinement." The symbolic object that defined this experience was not weapon or document or artifact, but the ocean itself. Vast, indifferent to human conflict. The same water that touched German shores and American shores and every shore between. The ocean represented abundance of a kind that no propaganda had prepared them for. Not material abundance, though that too had surprised them, but abundance of spirit, the capacity of their captors to provide something that served no military purpose, that contributed nothing to the war effort, that existed simply as gesture of humanity extended from victor to defeated. Slowly, uncertainly, the prisoners began to move toward the water. Some removed their shirts, their boots, waded into the surf still wearing their trousers because they had no swimming clothes and had not expected to need any. Others stripped to their undergarments, testing the water temperature, adapting to the sensation of ocean swimming after months or years away from any body of water larger than canteen or shower. The American guards watched from the beach, their rifles held casually, maintaining security through presence rather than threat, positioned to prevent escape but not to prevent enjoyment. The water was warm, warmer than the Mediterranean where some of them had swum in what seemed like another lifetime, warmer than the North Sea where others had trained before deployment to Africa. The surf was gentle, rolling in with the kind of rhythmic predictability that made swimming effortless, that allowed even those whose strength had been diminished by combat and captivity to enjoy the water without exhaustion. The prisoners swam, floated, dove beneath waves, engaged in the kind of spontaneous play that soldiers everywhere exhibit when given opportunity for recreation. Splashing, racing, the universal behaviors of young men released temporarily from structure and constraint. On the beach, the American guards had set up stations with drinking water, with first aid supplies, with shade provided by canvas awnings. Every hour, a guard would call the prisoners out of the water for a break, ensuring they drank water to counter dehydration, ensuring no one overexerted themselves in the heat and the surf. The care was practical, born from military experience with managing men in challenging conditions, but it carried implications that went beyond mere logistics. The guards were responsible for prisoner welfare, not just prisoner security. They were ensuring that men who had fought against America, who might fight against America again if the war continued long enough for them to be exchanged or escape, were protected from harm while under American supervision. This paradox troubled some prisoners more than the captivity itself had. Werner Schmidt, a former corporal who had been captured at Kasserine Pass, later described the cognitive dissonance of being cared for by enemies. In the Wehrmacht, treatment of prisoners had been governed by ideology and military necessity. Soviet prisoners received brutal treatment justified by Nazi racial theories. Western prisoners received treatment that varied based on military situation and individual commander's disposition. But the American approach seemed to operate from different principles entirely. Prisoners were still enemies, but were also still human beings, entitled to treatment prescribed by international law and by moral frameworks that transcended immediate military advantage. The afternoon progressed in a kind of surreal normality. The prisoners swam, rested, swam again. Some groups formed to play informal games in the shallow water. Others simply floated, faces toward the sun, eyes closed, experiencing something that approximated peace despite the war that continued thousands of miles away in Europe and the Pacific. The American guards rotated through their positions, some watching attentively, others reading. A few even wading into the water themselves to cool off in the brutal Florida heat. The boundary between captor and captive remained but seemed less absolute than camp fences and guard towers made it appear. Lunch was provided. Sandwiches and fruit, simple food but plentiful, eaten sitting in the shade or on the sand, washed down with water that tasted faintly of chemicals from purification but was cold and abundant. The prisoners ate with the practiced efficiency of military men who had learned never to waste food, but they ate without the tension that sometimes characterized camp meals, without the constant awareness of scarcity and competition that governed eating in environments where resources were limited and strictly controlled. One incident, small but significant, occurred during the afternoon. A young prisoner, barely 20, swimming beyond the gentle surf into deeper water, got caught in a current and began struggling, his fatigue and diminished strength making it difficult to swim back toward shore. An American guard, seeing the distress, immediately stripped off his equipment and waded in, swimming out to assist. He reached the struggling prisoner, supported him, helped him back to shallow water, ensured he was uninjured and simply exhausted. The guard spoke no German, the prisoner minimal English, but the interaction required no complex language, human being helping human being, enemy helping enemy, because the immediate need transcended the political and military categories that defined their relationship. The watching prisoners absorbed this incident in silence. Under Nazi ideology, such behavior would have been weakness, sentimentality, failure to maintain proper psychological distance from the enemy. A guard who aided a prisoner in distress was neglecting his duty, compromising his vigilance, allowing emotion to override military discipline. But the American guard's actions seemed to be viewed by his fellow guards not as failure, but as appropriate response to emergency. Of course, you help someone drowning, regardless of who they are, because that's what decent human beings do when others are in danger. This casual humanitarianism was more subversive than any propaganda, because it demonstrated through action rather than argument that the American system operated from fundamentally different moral premises than the Nazi ideology the prisoners had served. Americans were not weak because they valued individual human life. They were not soft because they treated prisoners according to international law. They were not militarily inferior because they believed that even enemies deserved basic dignity and care. These qualities, which Nazi propaganda had characterized as weaknesses of democratic societies, appeared in practice to be sources of strength. Societies that valued human dignity attracted loyalty and cooperation in ways that coercion and brutality never could. As afternoon moved toward evening, the lieutenant who had addressed them in the morning approached again. The day was ending. They would be returning to camp soon. But before they left, he wanted them to understand something. This beach visit was not unique, not special treatment for this particular group. Other prisoner groups from other camps were brought here on rotation, given the same opportunity for recreation and respite. The American military had determined that prisoner morale affected camp security, that men who were treated with basic decency were less likely to cause problems or attempt escape, that small investments in prisoner welfare paid dividends in reduced conflict and improved cooperation. But beneath this practical explanation lay something deeper, something the lieutenant did not quite articulate but the prisoners could sense. The Americans believed, or at least acted as though they believed, that even in war, even toward enemies, certain standards of behavior should be maintained. Not because those standards were strategically advantageous, though they might be, but because those standards defined what America claimed to represent: a nation governed by law rather than arbitrary power, a society that valued individual dignity regardless of nationality or allegiance, a culture that maintained civilized norms even in the midst of civilization's greatest failure. The return journey was quiet. The prisoners, sunburned and salt-encrusted, exhausted from swimming and sun, rode in the truck beds with the kind of peaceful fatigue that follows physical recreation rather than physical labor. They watched the Florida landscape roll past: forest and swamp, small towns with houses that looked prosperous even in wartime, farms producing food in abundance that exceeded anything they had seen in Germany even before the war. The contrast between this landscape of peace and plenty and the devastated battlefields they had left behind in Africa and Europe was profound and disturbing. Back at Camp Blanding, evening roll call proceeded as usual. The prisoners were counted, accounted for, returned to their barracks for dinner and the routine of camp life. But something had shifted in a way difficult to articulate or measure. They had been given a day at the beach, a few hours of swimming, a glimpse of American abundance that extended not just to material goods, but to generosity of spirit. The gesture had cost their captors little: transportation, guard time, water, and food that would have been provided anyway. But it had communicated something about American values and American character that no amount of propaganda could have effectively conveyed. In the weeks that followed, the beach visit became a topic of frequent discussion among the prisoners. Some interpreted it cynically, as manipulation designed to make them compliant and cooperative. Others saw it as confirmation that the Americans were soft, unable to maintain proper military discipline even toward enemies. But many, perhaps the majority, absorbed a different lesson: that the nation they had fought against operated from principles fundamentally different than the Nazi regime they had served. That strength and mercy were not opposites but could coexist. That treating enemies humanely was not weakness but confidence born from cultural and material advantages so overwhelming that small gestures of kindness cost nothing and gained much. Klaus Hartmann, the sergeant who had described his shock at being told to swim, eventually chose to remain in the United States after the war rather than return to a Germany he no longer recognized or wanted to rejoin. In a letter written years later to his sister who had stayed in Munich, he attempted to explain his decision. He described the day at the beach, the American guards who watched prisoners swim, the rescue of a struggling prisoner by an enemy who had every reason to let him drown, but chose to help instead. He wrote that this single day had taught him more about the difference between Nazi Germany and democratic America than all the combat and captivity that preceded it. The ocean that the prisoners had swum in continued rolling onto Florida beaches, indifferent to human conflict and human reconciliation. The war continued, grinding through its final year of European combat, consuming resources and lives at rates that made individual prisoner beach visits seem insignificant. But for the men who experienced those hours of swimming in Atlantic waters, who felt sun and surf and the temporary freedom of open water while technically still captives, the experience represented something more significant than its scale suggested. It represented the abundance at the heart of American power, not just material abundance, though America's industrial and agricultural capacity dwarfed Germany's, but abundance of spirit that allowed generosity toward enemies, that permitted small acts of mercy even during total war, that demonstrated through gesture rather than argument that democratic societies could maintain humane values even while prosecuting mechanized warfare on unprecedented scale. The swimming itself became symbol of this abundance, water extending to horizons, available without limit, shared freely even with those who had fought against the nation that controlled these shores. In Germany, in the desert campaigns where many of these prisoners had served, water was precious, rationed, controlled, a source of constant anxiety and careful calculation. But here, in Florida, prisoners swam in water so abundant that individual consumption was meaningless, in an ocean so vast that no human agency could control or restrict it. The physical abundance of water became metaphor for the larger abundance of American society. Resources so plentiful that sharing with enemies cost nothing. Capacity so overwhelming that small acts of generosity were not weakness but expression of strength so secure it could afford to be magnanimous. The guards who watched German prisoners swim in Florida waters were not liberals making political statements or idealists trying to prove moral superiority. They were ordinary American soldiers following orders that derived from military pragmatism and cultural values that made prisoner welfare a legitimate concern rather than irrelevant luxury. They maintained security because that was their job, but they did not interpret security as requiring cruelty or even coldness. They could be professional without being brutal, could maintain distance without dehumanizing, could follow orders while exercising judgment about how those orders should be implemented. This balance between authority and humanity characterized the American military approach in ways that prisoners recognized as fundamentally different from Wehrmacht culture. In German military tradition, discipline required harshness, authority demanded unquestioning obedience, and any deviation from rigid structure was weakness to be punished. But American guards seemed to operate from different assumptions. Discipline could coexist with flexibility, authority could be maintained without brutality, security could be ensured while still treating prisoners as human beings deserving of basic dignity and occasional mercy. The transformation this experience worked on prisoners was subtle, but real. They did not suddenly abandon German identity or embrace American values wholesale. But they did absorb evidence that contradicted propaganda they had been taught about American society and American character. They learned through direct experience that abundance could coexist with military effectiveness, that treating enemies humanely did not indicate weakness, that a society built on democratic principles and respect for individual dignity could still mobilize overwhelming force when necessary. The beach where they swam eventually returned to civilian use after the war ended. The prisoners who swam there eventually went home or stayed in America, making choices based on what they had learned during captivity about comparative societies and what kind of future they wanted. The war became history, then memory, then stories told by aging men about their youth, in circumstances their children and grandchildren could barely imagine. But the lesson of that August day in 1944 persisted, that even in war, even toward enemies, even when victory seemed assured, the way a nation treats those under its power reveals more about its character than all its stated principles and proclaimed values. America took German prisoners to a beach and let them swim, and in that simple gesture communicated more about democratic abundance and confident strength than any propaganda could have achieved, demonstrating that true power included the power to be merciful, and that the greatest victories were won not just on battlefields but in the hearts of defeated enemies who learned through experience that the nation they had fought against was not the enemy their ideology had described, but something far more formidable, a society whose strength included the capacity for generosity, even toward those who had wished it harm.